If we took a little trip inside my mind, past the copious amounts of useless fun facts, random song lyrics, and arguments that I have locked and loaded for the next time my friends Mo and Kasha make fun of the MCU, you would find a frightening amount of absolute nothingness. My brain is just a vacuum. Because it sucks. The one good thing about having absolutely no substance inside my little dome is that I have the time to overanalyze everything. And that includes all of the media that I enjoy. Sometimes I just sit there for hours and think about why I like a certain movie, a certain game, outside of I killed man with sword so serotonin. And it was during one of these incredibly unproductive moments that I had a bit of a realization. I started listing out a few of my favorite games ever. The Last of Us, God of War 4, Uncharted, Bioshock, Bloodborne, and as I kept listing out more and more, I started noticing that a lot of these games would probably also find themselves together on a list of some of the best video game openings of all time. The Baldur fight, Sarah's death, the plane crash, and I wondered if this was all just correlation or if there was some kind of causality behind all of this. Not every game that I love to death has a great intro, but a sizable portion do, and as gaming continues to streamify itself with PlayStation Now, Google Stadia, Xbox Game Pass, whatever Amazon's doing, it's becoming more common for the first 30 minutes to an hour of a game to dictate whether I'll play it all the way through or drop it on the spot. I usually don't stop playing games 10 hours in, sometimes, but not often. Typically it's in the introduction where the game can make or break itself, so I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into what exactly makes a good video game introduction. Oh, and by the way, I got a green screen, if you couldn't tell. And I got myself a background for my analysis videos. I call it the lab. So, yeah, go back to the intro now. Video game tutorials, from my experience, can lie anywhere on a spectrum that has two ends, which I call static tutorials and active tutorials. Purely static tutorials are the ones that essentially stop everything that's going on around you and explain in detail what everything in the game does. They'll take you on this 20-minute tour of some complicated menu and hope that you manage to absorb it all. Whereas purely active tutorials are ones where the game doesn't even bother telling you what the controls are, you're just left to fend entirely on your own, and you probably spend the first minute of a game just hitting every button to see what it does. I hate static tutorials. They are the bane of my existence. It takes all the strength in my body to not just spam the skip button and get the overload of text off my screen. And honestly, sometimes I still do it because I just can't be bothered to read this all. Every time I open up a game and there's this massive menu with text boxes explaining everything, or there's pop-ups to tell you what every material is for, or the game decides to entirely pause itself and tell you what every tiny indicator on the HUD means, my interest in the game absolutely plummets, and I don't feel like I'm playing a game. I feel like I'm looking at a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. Purely active tutorials aren't perfect either. They're usually fine for people who are more fluent in their understanding of standard game design, but for any newcomers or people who don't typically play the genre at hand, they can make everything more confusing than it needs to be. Both ends can lead to an overflow of information. But I still prefer purely active tutorials over purely static ones because while they both have their downsides, the former is more seamlessly integrated into the game and it makes it easier for the player to dive into the more enjoyable parts of it much faster. If there's a sweet spot here, I don't think it lies in the middle. I think it skews a little bit more to the active side for the reasons that I just mentioned. And while it's tougher for certain games to pull this off than others because of just how complicated certain game systems can be, I think every game should strive to tutorialize itself as actively as possible given the constraints their mechanical complexity poses, because wanting to avoid the slog of the opening hours of a strategy or JRPG game is a big part of why myself and others never even attempt to give those games a shot. Spider-Man PS4 is a nice quick example of where exactly you want to be with this active tutorial thing. Within like 30 seconds you're out swinging in New York City, and inside of those first few minutes you're being taught how to play the game in a clear way while still feeling like the game is in full swing. The tutorials slow down time in some instances, so you have a little bit more time to understand what's being asked of you, but there's a continual momentum. You know those titration experiments in chemistry class where you basically had a pipette and you would drip feed a bunch of titrant into the titrant? Thanks for making that not confusing science. And basically you just kind of slowly drip feed some of this liquid into this one and nothing happened, and then boom, all of a sudden it's red. Basically it's wound up reaching its endpoint. Something interesting finally happens, and that's kind of how I see tutorials. The endless, slow, agonizing drip feed speed of a static tutorial makes it take way too long for us to escape the learning section and reach the point where we're playing the game for real. And it's much more desirable to speed up that titration process to get you where you want faster, although going too fast might mean that you won't get all the information you need, so you have to hold back a little bit. Listen, I'm calling this show The Lab. Did you think I wasn't gonna pretend to know science? I'm gonna pretend my ass off. A couple of my favorite recent examples of active tutorials done well came in last year's Ghostrunner and Ghost of Tsushima, which apparently I picked two ghost-related games, which is either done for symmetry or because I didn't realize while I was writing this that I made that mistake. But you'll never know that it was that second one. Ghostrunner gives you about 10 seconds to prepare yourself before it kicks into high gear. You have a cutscene where you stab this dude and then have fun. Within another 2 seconds, you're wall running and dashing through the air and slicing up dudes with no remorse. You learn to get better by playing and seeing a couple prompts on screen, and that's all. When you gain new powers, there is a short explanation that comes along with it, but most of your understanding on which situations these powers would be the most useful in comes from the multiple simulations that the game gives that make the game's tutorials far more show than they are tell. Ghost of Tsushima gives you a dramatic opening cutscene and then thrusts you directly into a freaking war. You're immediately asked to ride your horse into battle and fight. By the time you see this many enemies ready to meet you in combat, you haven't even been told whether light attack is square or R1. But the game also gives you allies during this section that can make up for your mistakes in these early minutes. They fling you in head first, but they make sure there's cushioning for if you land awkwardly. So even though there's a good chance that you don't have your feet under you at this point, you're not so sure when to block and when the parry timings are, and you might just look like a chicken with its head cut off. The scenario around you as you figure this out, mixed with your fail-safes and a guiding hand, makes this feel like one of the most engaging intros ever made, while also making sure you feel adept at the base combat before you're even taught the specifics a little later on. These games do, in fairness, have the luxury of not being super mechanically complicated. You don't have to explain many things in these games, but there's still a right and wrong way to do even simple tutorials. Look at Final Fantasy VII Remake. That intro is so mysterious and grand and cool, and then, okay. Thank you. Let me get back to this. Okay, and yeah. Okay. Oh, never mind. Okay. Can you get this? Are you serious? Are you just let me play? Shut up! Oh my god! I don't need a hard stop and a block of text to explain to me how to hit things, how to jump over things, and how to block and dodge. Just put that at the bottom of the screen. Stop stopping me from enjoying this cool section. Tutorials aren't the end-all be-all of intros though, obviously. They can help with momentum and making sure that you get into stuff really quickly, but I think that just as important is trying to build up intrigue in the world, the story, or the lore of the game. I think my personal runner-up for the best video game introduction ever is Bioshock, because I played it when I was 14, and in the first 5 minutes I was acutely aware that I was dealing with something the likes of which I had never seen before. It pains me a little not to have Bioshock in the next section of this video, Atmosphere, because I firmly believe this game's atmosphere is unrivaled. It beats out everything else by a country mile. But I think while atmosphere is what affected us most when playing Bioshock and when looking back on it, intrigue is what captured our minds the second that we booted the game up. Bioshock is now so ingrained in the zeitgeist of modern gaming that it's a genuine struggle to remember what it was like before experiencing it, how it felt to not know who Andrew Ryan was, to not know what Rapture was. And yet, of course, you do know none of that when you enter this lighthouse. After an understated cutscene and a plane crash that really already fills your head with an endless string of questions, you wind up in a bathysphere that hits you with some philosophical conundrums that you were not prepared for this early on, and it reveals to you the world of Rapture. It's haunting but beautiful, and you hear the ideas behind its creation in the background as you pass it by, which are delivered in such a way that makes you feel a sense of understanding for why it was made. It almost starts making sense to you, and then...
Don't hurt me! Just let me go! You might cut!
The second that you leave your bathysphere and start your tour of Rapture, you have one question. What the hell happened? Bioshock starts with a plane crash, and somehow that's the least insane part of this intro. The juxtaposition of theory and execution of Ryan's dream world leaves you trying to pick up on every clue you can. There's so much to wonder about. And I think the reason why we trust Atlas so quickly and so completely is because he has answers, and we desperately need them. Creating such a captivating mystery predominantly through visuals alone makes the game so difficult to put down. You just want to keep going and know more. Prey 2016 does something similar with a space space station and the outbreak of the mimics. You don't know anything about the characters here or the purpose of these experiments or how these creatures were let loose, and you feel the need to answer those questions. But sometimes intrigue doesn't have to come from something as grand as a mysterious world with morbid creatures and a quiet devastation. Sometimes it can just be as simple as, how's this happen then? Uncharted 2, which has maybe the most famous video game intro ever, hooks you in an instant not just because of its crazy set piece, but by making you think, bro, how the hell did you get there? The second Uncharted game begins in Medea's Res, which I believe roughly translates to, I'm a condescending weasel nut who thinks I'm intellectually superior to you because I know a couple common phrases in Latin. Or it translates to in the middle of things. It's one of those two for sure. By starting like this, the audience knows basically nothing except whatever got me here must have been absolutely wild. Meaning at minute 0, you already have the player ready to spend hours trying to figure out what sequence of events could have possibly led to this. And then once they get to that point that explains it, the hope is that they're invested enough in everything else that they also trek to the end. Give the player a broken world with no explanation or a burst of action with no context, and they desperately want to find that missing piece of the puzzle. Like, pretend I'm a pathologist, right, and I'm inspecting cadavers, and Red Dead 2 rolls up in here, and I'm looking at it, and at first glance it just looks like a normal body. It's like, okay, the first few hours are not that interesting. I'm like, okay, it's another heart attack, woo! But eventually, it hooks me. It starts getting a little bit more interesting. I'm noticing markings over here. There's signs of poison. Wow, I'm really into this now. And that's cool and all. But Uncharted 2 has a train sticking out of its chest. How did that get there? What's going on? Who did this to you? I don't know, but I want to. If these two roll up into my office at the same time, guess which one I'm inspecting first? And in the same way, I think if you give someone an hour with both of these games with them having no prior knowledge of video games or who made what or how well liked either one is, 11 out of 10 times that person is picking Uncharted 2 unless they have a cowboy fetish, and that's important. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, yeah, I gave up on Red Dead 2 after the first few hours, and how much it hurts because, yeah, me too. And frankly, the only reason why I played past that was because it was a birthday present and I felt bad not playing it. And in the end, it wound up being one of my favorite games ever made, but there was a good chance that in any other circumstance, I never would have played past the 3-hour mark because it's such a slow burn, and games being as long as they are the worst medium for a slow burn. But as important as I find active tutorials and intrigue to the beginning of a game, there's one thing that a game can do that stands above all else. If something does this, it has a 99% chance of just keeping my attention for the entire way through, and that is setting an effective tone and atmosphere. Sometimes the actual substance of something isn't as important as its presentation. I like Gatorade fine enough, but if somebody comes up to me while we're hanging out and hands me a bottle and is like, hey, you want some? I'm gonna turn it down most of the time. But if I show up to a place and they have Gatorade in like fancy glasses with ice cubes in it, dude, I'm gunning for that Gatorade every single time, and somehow it's gonna taste better being in this glass. I don't know how, but don't tell me that it doesn't taste better in a glass. And this is actually known as the scientific principle of I have no idea, I just feel really fancy doing this. Bloodborne might be the simplest intro I bring up in this video. There's only a bit of dialogue, then you karate chop a werewolf, then you learn about 2% of what's going on, and the rest is just world building, and yet that's all it needs to be. Being brought to the ethereal space of the hunter's dream and then sent back into dark corridors only to step outside and be met with the desolate streets of Yharnam is kind of enough said moment. And one thing that this game I think kind of shows is that as powerful as creating atmosphere is for engaging the player immediately, it's equally as difficult to pull off because it's the most intangible thing I've mentioned today. There's no guideline for creating atmosphere. There's stuff that's usually a safe bet, but not every dark, moody location is instantaneously atmospheric. And I think that's what makes the last two sections really important. They're more quantifiable. Bloodborne is a really enjoyable game to play, but it's one of the GOATs because of its atmosphere. If you took that away though, the game would still be pretty amazing. Like, imagine the game had the same level layouts, weapons, combat, enemy attacks, all of that was the same, but Yharnam was bright yellow and all the enemy designs weren't they were puppies. Although I guess that second one would just make it a Dark Souls game. The game would be worse for sure, but still pretty amazing, but the intro would suffer immensely. The instant reason that you have to explore every single crevice in this world is no longer there, and so you're less captivated by this experience. I think the reason I never got into Neo is because its world was just meh and everything looked dull. Even though the basics of the combat were really fun, I was just not that interested. There's definitely a great game in there, it just didn't convince me early on enough that that game was worth finding. My personal favorite video game introduction gets by almost entirely on atmosphere. Batman Arkham Knight starting with that creepy song playing over the Joker's cremation with all the expectations of some kind of jump scare lingering over it all, a feeling that they play with later on, and then the first-hand experience of the fear toxin and how it affected the citizens to go on a frenzy, the absolute chaos on display as the atmosphere pans to the one man capable of stopping it all. When I replay Batman Arkham Knight, there's a portion of time where I just think, man, this might be the greatest game ever made, and then I eventually knock myself out of that. I realized that yes, it's amazing, but I wouldn't go that far. But for a while, it really feels like that, because the tone that's set here hits so fast and effectively that I can't help but be giddy every time I see it. Obviously, that isn't everything that can make a good intro. Sometimes it's about how it plays with your emotions, sometimes it's about the epic atmosphere of it all, but I think those are some of the most tried and true methods that you see out there. With so many options of what to play out there now, I feel like it's really important for a game to get its hooks in me as early as possible. Whether that's presenting me immediately with an interesting world and lore, giving me something to wonder about in the game's early hours, or just making sure it's not wasting my time and its momentum early on, most games have 1 hour to convince me that they're worth playing. It's a really tough thing to pull off, and most games struggle with it, but if you can do it right, then I feel like you look back way more fondly on the game because it captivated your interest from the second you put it in. Let me know what some of your favorite video game intros are in the comments. If you're new here, subscribe. If you enjoyed it, like the video, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.